Hi, thank you for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell, and this video is part of a series of videos on the elements of theology. So today I'm going to be talking about propositions 25 through 27. As I've been doing throughout the series, I am using the Dodds translation. For those of you who do not have the paper version of it, there is a link in the description box for a PDF version. Okay, so up to this point, this is what we've seen so far. We saw that there are different realms of reality. Each one has a monad at its head, and that monad then creates the series. It generates the series and also determines the order of each member in the series. Today, what we're going to be doing is building on this. And of course, the one is the first cause of all. And the monads then imitate the one, as we've seen in some of the past propositions. And we're going to see this idea of this imitation repeating itself and continuing on in the propositions to follow. So proposition 25 is really taking this whole idea that we've seen already and really focusing on the idea of generation. Now, we've already seen in some of the past propositions that that generation is a sign of the completeness and the power of the monad. But 25 really is focusing on this idea of the generating quality of the monads, of the principles. And it's saying that that which is higher can create more. It generates more. Okay, so with that introduction in mind, let's take a look at proposition 25. It states that whatever is complete proceeds to generate those things which it is capable of producing, imitating in its turn the one originative principle of the universe. So there again, there's that idea of the monads imitating the one or the good. And to explain this, he says, for that principle, that's a reference, of course, back to the one or the good, for that principle, because of its own goodness, is by a unitary act constitutive of all that is. For the good being identical with the one, which is proposition 13, it means that action which has the form of goodness is identical with unitary action. And in a like manner, the principles that are consequent upon it are impelled because of their proper completeness to generate further principles inferior to their own being. And that's a reference back to proposition 7. Okay, now I'm going to take the sentence backwards and start with the end here. The reason proposition 7 is cited here by Dodds is because proposition 7 is the one that stated that causes are always superior to their effects. And so showing again, there's that hierarchy, that intellect is higher than soul, which is higher than nature. Now, this idea, though, of proper completeness is a very confusing one when we're first introduced to it. We think of completeness as an all or nothing. If it's not fully complete, then it's not complete, it's incomplete. But this idea of proper completeness is really central to the way the whole hierarchy unfolds. And so it's a very important one to understand. So what we're seeing here, and what will become clear as we go on, is this idea that the higher principles are more unified and more potent. And it's in that regard that he talks about each having its own proper completeness. So soul is complete. The monad soul is complete at its own proper power. But the monad intellect is even more potent. And so in that relative sense, you can say that it is more complete. And so that's what he means here. And so he's setting up the idea that the higher principles will be able to generate more than the lower principles. Going on here, he says that completeness is a part of the good, and the complete as complete imitates the good. I want to pause here for just a moment to clarify that the good, of course, does not have parts. That's not what he's saying here. What he's saying here is that completeness is a term that is categorized with the good. So we've already seen that there are certain terms that we would use when we're talking about the one. And we're talking about things like unity or unified or whole, things like this. We associate those with the one. When we're talking about perfection, completion, desire, appetite, think words like this, we refer to the good. And so there's different terminology that is used with each. And the idea of completeness is associated with the idea of the good. And by the way, some translations use perfection here instead of complete. So like if you were to read Thomas Taylor's translation, he talks about perfection here in Proposition 25 instead of completeness. So it's the same idea in Greek. Okay, so completeness then is an aspect of the good in the sense that it's a term that we associate with good. And the complete as complete then imitates the good. Okay, he goes on then to say, now we saw that the good was constitutive of all things, and that's Proposition 12. Accordingly, the complete is by nature productive within the limits of its power. The more complete, there's again that idea of a relative completeness. Each realm is complete, but the higher realms are more complete, you might say, than the lower ones. So the more complete is the cause of more, in proportion to the degree of its completeness. For the more complete participates the good more fully. That is, it is nearer to the good. That is, it is more nearly akin to the cause of all. So it is the cause of more. And he goes on to say that the less complete is the cause of less in proportion to its incompleteness. And I think incompleteness is a little misleading because, again, the monad soul is complete in its own proper power, but relative to the monad intellect, it's relatively incomplete is what he means. For being more remote from that which produces all. It is constitutive of fewer things, since to constitute or regulate or complete or maintain or vitalize or create a large class of things approaches nearest to the universal performance of these functions, while a like service to a smaller class stands at a further remove. So notice there that he's telling us then the functions of these monads or principles. And so the corollary here then is also adding one further assumption that we can make, or inference rather, one inference we can make from all that we have seen here. So if there's a diminution of this generative power, then it means that when you get to the very end, obviously you've reached that which cannot produce anything, because if it could produce, then it wouldn't be the last. Okay, and that of course would be the realm of materiality. He says, from this it is apparent that the principle most remote from the beginning of all things is sterile and a cause of nothing. For if it generate and have a consequent, it is plain that it can no longer be the most remote. Its product is more remote than itself, and itself is brought nearer by the fact of producing another, whatever that other be, and thus imitating the cause which is productive of all that is. And so again, what he showed us here is that intellect generates more than does soul. And that's why I have the realms overlapping one another. And when you get to the bottom, to the last realm here, now you have reached that which is sterile. And for example, in the allegory of the cave, the wall that the shadows are cast on, that wall represents the realm of materiality. So the realms above it, which is nature and soul, and in later writings, of course, Proclus separates those. The realm of nature does also generate, and it's the realm of materiality. Those two are separated. That is the passive receiver of natural and psychical reason principles. So it receives those principles. It has a certain intelligibility to it in that regard. So the realm of intellect does reach down into that final realm as well. But its intelligibility, you might say, is expressed in being a passive receiver of reason principles. Okay, now that Proclus has introduced the idea of generation, he is ready to introduce the very famous triad of remaining, proceeding, and reverting. This is a staple to Platonic metaphysics. And what we're going to look at today is the first term, the remaining term. And what he has to show is that the remaining term stays complete even though it's creating. It's creating without actually changing or becoming less. And in fact, for this one, I'm actually going to jump us down to the corollary first so that we can see this conclusion. So the productive principles remain undiminished by the production from them of secondary existences. For what is in any way diminished cannot remain as it is. So the first term must remain. And that's what he's arguing here. So Proposition 26 states, every productive cause produces the next and all subsequent principles, while itself remaining steadfast. So we often represent this with a triangle. So this would be the top of the triangle, what we call the hyparxis. He says, if it imitates the one, and so here's this idea again, it's going to run throughout as is a very key idea here, that the principles or the monads imitate the one. And if it imitates the one, and if the one brings its consequence into existence without movement, then every productive cause has a like law of production. So these hyparxes, these monads, then create without movement. Now, his explanation of why the one must create without movement is a little bit confusing, but let's just run through it. Now, the one does create without movement, for if it create through movement, either the movement is within it, and being moved it will change from being one and so lose its unity, or if the movement be subsequent to it, then this movement will itself be derived from the one, and either we shall have an infinite regress, or the one will produce without movement. Basically, what he's saying here is that if the one were to move, it would no longer be one, and so there cannot be movement in the one. And so you would, even if you imagine different steps in between and there's an infinite regress, you ultimately come back to this conclusion. Now, secondly, every productive principle will imitate the one, the productive cause of the sum of things. For the non-primal is everywhere derived from the primal, so that a principle that is productive of certain things must derive from the principle which produces all things. So, for example, the monad intellect creates things that are intellectual, but it must get, in itself, its cause would be that which is the cause of all beyond it. So the one is beyond all of the other principles. So therefore, every productive principle produces its consequence while itself remaining steadfast. Okay, so this idea of this production without itself moving, without becoming less, then is key. And now he's going to kind of put it all together. Proposition 27 is kind of building, it's kind of a rewording, if you will, of Proposition 25. In 25, we saw that that which is complete and powerful will create to the degree of its own power. And so those that are more potent will create more. 27 is really focusing on the idea that it is because of the completeness and potency that these principles can produce. Because of is the key phrase here. So he just wants to just kind of tie up any loose ends here by clarifying, by having a proposition that clearly states that it's because of this completeness and potency. Okay, now in this first sentence here in the explanation, notice the way that he sort of very subtly implies that completeness and potency are either equated or they're closely correlated. He said, for if it had produced not because of its completeness, but by reason of a defect of potency, it could not have maintained unmoved its own station. I'm going to pause there for just a moment. Notice the relationship there between completeness and potency. It's not because of its completeness, but by reason of its incompleteness. That would make sense, but he didn't say that. He said it's not if it had produced not because of its completeness, but by reason of a defect of potency. And so there you're seeing that he's implying there a direct correlation between completeness and potency. And his explanation of why this would be a problem. That why it could not have maintained its own station. Were this true, he says, that which through defect or weakness bestows existence upon another furnishes the substance of that other by a conversion and alteration of its own nature. But every producer remains as it is, and its consequent proceeds from it without change in its, the producer's, steadfastness. Okay, and remember that was Proposition 26. And he says, full and complete then, it brings to existence the secondary principles without movement and without loss, itself being what it is, neither transmuted into the secondaries nor suffering any diminution. For the product is not a parceling out of the producer, and that's not even a character of physical generation or generative causes. Right? So think of any kind of generation in our physical world, whether you're talking about mammals giving birth to their babies or you're talking about animals that lay eggs. You're not going to find the mother giving part of her body to this baby and another part to that baby. That's not how it works. It's not a transformation, he goes on to say. The producer is not the matter of what proceeds from it, for it remains as it is. Its product is a fresh existence beside itself. So the mama and the baby are two separate existences, and they both have their full number of body parts. Thus, the engenderer is established beyond alteration or diminution, multiplying itself in virtue of its generative potency, and furnishing from itself secondary substances. Okay, so there now we have the remaining term that is going to produce something else, and that which it produces is that which proceeds. And so the next set of propositions are going to deal with procession, and we're going to see that this is where he brings in the idea of likeness as a generative cause of the whole of the all. So I do hope that you found that helpful. If you did, I would appreciate you hitting the like button. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave those in the comments section, or you can send me an email. There is an email address at the bottom of the description box. And as always, I do hope that you will subscribe if you don't already, and I hope that you will join me next time as I go on with 28 through 30, I think will be the next video. So I hope you'll join me for that. Thank you very much.